So those were two really amazing, really beautifully thought out academic talks. Um, well researched and well reasoned. And now I'm going to talk for 20 minutes about memes and people who have penises. Brief disclaimer first. The following talk consists of three brief, interconnected Zizekian interventions into the lore of Warhammer 40,000. It applies critiques of historical authoritarianism to a fictional setting for entertainment purposes only. As a public school employee in the United States of America, I am not implying a connection to any political figure currently living, dead, or in between. Sitting on a golden throne, perhaps. Sitting on something golden, anyway. I should also acknowledge that some might consider me the wrong kind of Jewish person to be delivering a talk on anti-Semitism. They're correct at a minimum in that all communities define themselves by exclusion. I'm just disappointed to be the at least one excluded. Part 1. Men who aren't castrated. Jacques Lacan introduced the formulas of sexuation in the early 70s, drawing on, some might say abusing, set theory to articulate potential subjective positions. We'll look at just the first of these from the left or male side. There exists at least one not subject to the phallic function. The set of all men is bound by an at least one who doesn't have to give up any jouissance, who Lacan calls the whole man, or all man, the symbolic father. Jouissance could here be translated simply as enjoyment, though it includes the repetitive satisfaction we derive from scratching an itch, poking at loose fillings, or ranting about the present administration. It's not always entirely pleasant or something we fully control. In explicitly Freudian terms, it's an enjoyment we are driven to. Now, this formula references the father of the primal horde from Totem and Taboo. The pseudo-mythological daddy who gets the satisfaction of all the cute Eldar mommies and is murdered by jealous sons, who afterwards limit their own enjoyment such that none gets all. Freud's means of articulating psychoanalytic phenomena in this respect veers dangerously close to a summary of the Horus heresy. The foundational trauma bounding the Imperium of mankind. As Lacan says, they killed him, my goodness, because they loved him. Oh, there's the cute elder mommy. Of course, as the ensuing part proved. The ensuing part is woeful. Indeed, it is the Imperium itself which must surrender its potential enjoyment before that war is over. Whoops. American theorist Susan Barnard sees this formula applying to many more than one man. The myth of the primal father allows the would-be all-man to disavow his own symbolic castration, to maintain, quote, a kind of distance towards it, through believing in an exception to symbolic law. In other words, mistaking an open set for a closed set, which unfortunately can have totalitarian consequences. The Lacanian unconscious is a machine constructed of signifiers, and it has instrumentalized our psyches, made them sites of viral reproduction. Language, in a very actual way, leaves us lacking. And if we believe in exceptions to the symbolic law, we can easily come to interpret this structural lack as evidence of something taken from us, stolen even. Let's say milk, to give a good Freudian example. Libidinally invested, directly connected to actual parents. Actual parents, whatever their gender, who will soon be replaced in the child's imagination by the creatively named imaginary father. The father, Lacan says, who has fucked the kid up. 18 or so odd kids in the case of the Horus heresy. Whoops, I'm ahead of myself again. That we can imagine parents as all-powerful and all-loving is why, for Lacan, the imaginary father is also the model of the Anselmic deity. An attempt to apply the same sort of essentialist ontology to the primal father, though, produces the most extreme form of authority. What Zizek labels the obscene anal father, which first found full expression in the so-called great men of 20th century totalitarianism. There's the Mussolinis. The would-be masters of enjoyment, reinvested with the jouissance of a modern primal horde. The latter, having confused myth and history, mistake a mere symbolic law for one concerning materiality, libidinally investing in the success of political figures, with lack as obvious as their comb-overs. Entertainment purposes only. Freud proved a better fortune teller than myth maker, sadly. This confusion, however, marks the social field broadly. A community, be it Socialist Federal Republic or WhatsApp chat, is ultimately an attempt to enact symbolic law in actuality, and it requires an exclusion, a constitutive outside, as Judith Butler says, where, quote, those exclusions haunt signification as its abject borders. We just learned this week that Dr. Butler, another wrong kind of Jew, is currently being investigated federally on suspicion of anti-Semitism. I don't really know how to make that funny. I think that they will probably be fine, though I worry for all the 100+ non-famous academics included on that list, along with them. Where were we? Exclusion. Ignoring the inherently symbolic nature of this exclusion can have disastrous consequences once we attempt a material enactment especially for those abject subjects caught between open and closed sets, dwelling on the totalitarian community's structurally hazy borders. Part 2. The Jew does not exist. Structurally doomed to fail before it even starts. The problem, as Zizek observes, is that, in a way, totalitarian ideology knows it. All ideology, for Zizek, is ultimately fantasy. The difference between what we think we are doing... Whoops. Oh, well, I may have gotten those out of order. What we think we are doing, purging his holy Imperium of corruption, and what we are actually doing, immolating elder children. Totalitarianism is a fantasy which contains within its own construction a mechanism for justifying future failures. This mechanism produces a universal justification, a little bit of the outside within, which Zizek names the Jew for obvious reasons. Inherent social antagonisms have often been projected onto actual Jewish communities, and the Jew, in turn, becomes fantastically identified as the singular cause of social blockages that are, in actuality, structural. Now, an actual Jew might wander near that overdetermined nodal point from time to time. There is always a Jew wandering somewhere, to reference a famous anti-Semitic myth. I think he's called the Eternal Jew in Germany. I won't attempt to pronounce that. But if all the Jews went away, God forbid, the antagonism wouldn't. The quilting would continue, and a new the Jew would soon be found. A new rotfly floating on the surface, the boundary of the otherwise delicious social milk. But if the Jew isn't always a Jew, how is it that Jews, rather than any other historical group, came to be so closely identified with the structural role in the Western symbolic? Literature professor Aaron Graf Ziven posits one of the best explanations. The Jew, which she wisely rebrands as the wandering signifier, isn't like most others because it won't sit still in its metonymic vacillations. It can't ever be pinned in place, and ultimately comes to culturally embody contradiction as such. This antagonism, mirroring that of society itself, Lacanians do so love mirrors, allows the wandering signifier to become libidinally invested in ways useful for quilting over the contradictions, preventing the symbolic order containing them from ever becoming a closed set. There is, as Graf Ziven says, a double movement at work. Society creates an ambivalent figure out of its anxiety, and its anxiety, in turn, is fueled by the contradictory figure it has imagined. Rather than xenophobia, which describes anxiety around those beyond their supposed proper place, the correct term for this particular species of anxiety, originally coined by Zygmunt Bauman, is proteophobia, the fear of others whose proper place is indeterminate, who exist on the abject boundary, or as it, who call the very nature of the set into question, challenging even our very conception of nature. For Graf Zivan, Jewishness in Europe had to become racialized once Jews began passing for any other Westerners, making it harder to identify both the self and the set containing it. Anyone could be a Jew. I didn't even know I was Jewish until adulthood, when an aunt did some genealogical digging around under my father's family tree. We lurk amongst you, even to our own surprise. In 40K terms, proteophobia isn't the healthy, natural disgust a loyal citizen might have for those cud-chewing blue-skinned bastards seducing imperial worlds in the Damocles Gulf with false promises of peace, land, and bread. Imagine instead the discomfort and confusion that some citizens experience around a sanctioned psyker. To say nothing of the shifty, smelly, and downright criminal abhuman elements employed by the Imperial Guard out of sheer necessity, certainly. The kind of discomfort that might make a less than faithful servant question a tenet or two of the Imperial Creed. Graf leaves open the possibility for other signifiers besides Jew to become similarly overdetermined, including other abject identities like prostitute or woman. Which does beg the question, in the collective fantasy of 40th second millennium mankind, who are the Jews in space? Now, squats don't count. It's low-hanging fruit. They even have Gollum. He's cute, though. He could avenge my bloodline anytime. I would argue that it would be more fruitful for us, in just this instance, to ignore the obvious superficial marks of classical anti-Semitism that we see, mostly unconsciously, reproduced in the diminutive, hook-nosed, and greedy dwarves of Disney, Dungeons and Dragons, and Dr. Tolkien. Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay? I did say mostly unconsciously reproduced, right? Those so-called others that could represent contradiction as such, allowing the loyal citizen of the Imperium to disavow both the fact that the Emperor now fails to bound the set he once bound, and the fact that the very boundaries of humanity are porous and purely symbolic. If I was discussing current events instead of speculative authoritarianism, I might suggest that in the West presently, the wandering signifier finds temporary rest still in the Jew, and not just the wrong kinds, it's worth pointing out, but also the asylum seeker or trans woman. Anyway, where were we? Differences. Part 3. It's the shortest part. Finally, let us touch on one glaring difference between the fictional Warhammer universes and our own. The Imperium of mankind is a functional theocracy in a setting where the existence of deities is not a question of faith. There exists more than at least one. It is merely the nature of individual divinity that remains debatable for any well-educated citizen inside the Imperium. Which, to be fair, may still be saying something. A lot of well-educated citizens, or excuse me, a lot of well-educated people over the years have found the ontological argument very convincing in our own very much less persuasive actual universe. Whatever the nature of these gods, they aren't Anselmic. If anything could ever justify a misapplication of one of the formulas of sexuation, it would hopefully be the shift in the boundaries of the real, arriving with the knowledge that not only do gods exist, but those same gods also lack. The potential for real castration of the divine is not even entirely off the table. A grimdark universe indeed. The emperor ceased being a Zizekian classical master sometime after the triumph of Olanor. And certainly once he ascended to the Golden Throne. It is his Imperium that becomes the true obscene anal father in the wake of the heresy, denying the mythology combed over an obvious castration. The Emperor of Mankind is ultimately still appropriately named, not because he rules mankind any longer, but because he is the master signifier mankind is ruled through. The totalitarian master differs from the classical master in that all his authority comes from the people's faith in him. Doubly true when the physical might of the Imperium comes from the collective fantasy mechanically maintaining it, and the literal psychic power of the undead emperor comes from the body of believers investing their libidinal energy in him. There can be jouissance in denying ourselves jouissance. I suffer. I sacrifice. I enlisted in the Guard instead of joining the local Slaneshi sex cult and meeting a nice non-binary demon named Todd. But I do this for the other. I give up Todd for the other, because the other, the Emperor, needs me. I have identified his lack with mine. Many, in the final accounting, give a lot more than their libidinal investments to the Emperor of Mankind. Indeed, far from preserving humanity, if we manage to traverse the totalitarian fantasy, we find the Emperor is, in actuality, preserved by humanity, mechanically fed by and on humanity, as every day hundreds of Imperial citizens are marched by their fellow humans into the waiting acephalous maw of the Golden Throne, some with faith in the Emperor, some without. Neither will be spared. Thank you.